Recording in progress. So welcome back to the second half. If you haven't done so, download the Lecture8 new.powerpoint Photoshop files, and we're going to take a look at what we have and start working in Photoshop. We've already established the need to make something repeatable. That brick wall pattern we tried to use, make it repeat to get the scale smaller. Turns out top and the bottom don't line up, left and right don't line up. We also want to get rid of the watermark. All right, so if you are running Maya, I highly suggest that you quit out of Maya to run Photoshop. However, if you like to live on the edge of a knife and take chances that one of them won't crash, okay. Generally, if there's a war between Maya and Photoshop, Maya usually loses. All right, so before we actually do all of that, let's take a look at Project 7. So Project 7, you will select one of your environments. Doesn't matter which one. And that will be the one that you will apply textures to. Yep, all you do is select one. Sounds simple enough. Now, in theory, you can use all of the materials that you did in Project 6 and then just add textures where needed. The problem is, not all of your materials you may be in love with, or you may not be able to find textures for the reference that you had. So you may wind up switching reference images. This is totally fine. This is a good time if you're not totally in love with your reference, get new reference. Figure out what you want to do. Not all objects need a texture. Just because we say texturing, as I mentioned earlier, doesn't mean you jump into substance. We're only requiring two objects done in substance, a wood object and a metal object. Which ones are your choice? They should be from the close-up shot. That way we can actually see the detail. Because honestly, you can do a lot of work in substance, and if you've got a long shot, and you're not that close to the camera, probably a lot of that work is going to be wasted. It's like level of detail with modeling. You want to put your money where the close-up shot is. All right, so select one of your environments, and that will be used as part of, well, as your Project 7. All right. Let's see, what else do we want to go? So it doesn't matter which one you do. Like I said, one of your environments, one of the environments that you did, let's be more specific. One of the environments that you did in Project 6, because you don't want to have to redo all of your work. You don't want to have to relight and rematerial something and then add textures. Honestly, there's not enough time. Okay, so just like with the previous, you are responsible for everything that's visible in the shot. You're going to do a long shot and a close-up. The close-up is where the detail of your texturing is going to be. The long shot can have textures in it, as long as your reference has a texture, and you need a texture, definitely put it in there. Okay, again, not all objects will require a texture. All right, so we have some milestones here. Today we're going to be doing the brick wall. I've got the workflow for the wooden floor and that alligator skin texture. They're not required. They're just there in case you want to try your hand at doing some other seamless texture work. Word of advice. If you think you might need seamless textures, you don't necessarily have to make them if you can find them. Remember, in your search parameters, you want to put down seamless texture. What's a good resolution? You want to have at least a 2K texture. 4K would be better, but 2K will work. This is what your resolution should be. All right, so substance milestone, one wood grained object, one metal object. Anything you do in substance, you must have reference for. You want to add wear and tear and dirt and usage and smudges. Find reference for that stuff you want to do. Everything requires reference. On Monday, we're going to get into doing at least, you're going to have at least one projection done in Maya. We're going to go over some Maya layering on Monday. And all your downloads are here. So there's the new PowerPoint. In fact, I'll download that. Why not? There's the Photoshop files. I've already got them, but why not? And templates. So the good news is with the Photoshop templates, you don't have to worry about sticking them on the right side to be black and white. Everything's going to be color. All right, so if you're doing the exterior, there's your template, long shot, close up. If you're doing the interior, it's going to be the standard HD size, long shot, close up. There is no adjustment layer to convert them to black and white. All right, so here are the Photoshop files. We've got a clone stamp practice image to play around with. Clone stamp is going to be our main tool in Photoshop to start removing seams. We're also going to be using the healing brush and a couple other things in Photoshop. There's the alligator skin texture, and there's the brick wall, and there's the wood. All right, the brick wall, honestly, is one of the easiest ones to make repeatable. That's why we're going to do it. Straight lines, mostly. Right angles, mostly. The second easiest is going to be the floor. Now, the floor does have some straight lines. You got the space between boards. This is a board-on-board texture where they stagger the boards on the floor. However, it does have that organic grain in the wood, which makes it a little more difficult. And you've got color variations. And then the hardest one is going to be this kind of reptile skin texture, because it has cells, but they're not straight lines. They're not right angles. They're very, you know, it just very organic looking. So that's going to be one of the harder ones. And here's our PowerPoint. So let's fire up ye olde PowerPoint. All right. So here is an example of that simple environment with the default textures assigned to them, more or less to the right scale compared to the image. And you can see that the brick wall does not line up very well at all. We've got seams in that alligator skin here on these little stools, and you definitely have seams on the floor where they are noticeably repeating. Now, once all of that's done and you make them repeatable and you make the various maps for them, then you've got something that looks a little more presentable. So the brick wall, the workflow is for the color and the bump map. For the floor, believe it or not, it is only the floor, but the same file that's used on the floor actually works as a bump map as well. The alligator skin texture, that is a color map, spec map, and a bump map. So the workflow for all of these is in here. No. The problem is with an image that you're using as a texture, for it to work, the low-lying areas in that texture must be dark and the high points must be lighter. A lot of times you don't always get that with a texture. It could be reversed or inverted. Also, a lot of times you don't necessarily want all of the, you don't want the entire surface to be a height map. You only want certain areas. It happens to work with the wood. Since you asked that question, let's take a look at it. All right, so if I were to look at this image in Photoshop, well, why don't I just do that? Because it helps to understand what we're looking at. So let me launch Photoshop. And let's go find the floor. Here we go. All right, so there's my floor. So notice this will also, I will answer your question directly, but this also helps me kind of bring up the topic of something called pixel density, which is basically how big are the pixels, how much room are they taking up on your screen or in your object. Now, right now, this we're looking at 100%. So the resolution for this would work at that scale. But if it needs to go on a really big object, we're going to start increasing the size of the object, making the pixels bigger. Remember, this is a fixed image, meaning it's got a resolution. When you look at it 100%, that's the pixels are at the optimal size for visual representation. As soon as you start making those pixels bigger, it starts to break up, it starts to get grainy, and it starts to become pixelated. So as you take a small image and enlarge it to fit a surface, you are forcing all those pixels to stretch out of shape and look bad. It doesn't matter whether you're doing it in real time, in the viewport, in a renderer, they all look bad. So the whole idea is you want to make sure that you keep your pixel density or the resolution of the image at the size it's supposed to. If you need it to fill a bigger space, you need to find a better resolution texture. Does that make sense? All right, so back here, I don't care if we blow it up right now because this is only for visual. All right, so in a bump map, let's identify what we need. So we got black and white. What does black do? What does white do? Yep, black goes in, white goes up. So down, up, in, out, however you want to look at it. So black goes down or in. This goes up or out. Suppose you don't want change on the surface at all. 50% gray. So all of this will help us answer why this image works as a bump map. So first off, let's look at it as though this were a black and white image. Now in Photoshop, a lot of times you can just go up to image, you can go to mode, you can make it grayscale. However, if you do that, you're actually altering the original pixels. Whenever I'm in Photoshop, I always preach, and everybody gets sick of hearing this, non-destructive workflow. I want to keep the image as original as possible, and I will alter layers to get the result I want rather than changing original pixels. So in Photoshop, it has a system of layers called adjustment layers. It's this half dark, half light circle. Whatever layer you have selected, if you go down there, you can create one of these adjustment layers that will let you adjust contrast and brightness. It'll let you adjust, color. It'll let you do all kinds of post things. Just make it black and white. So now we're looking at this image in black and white. And we can see immediately the area between the boards is darker than the boards themselves. And all the grain in the wood is slightly darker than the wood itself. And that's generally the way wood looks, right? The grain is usually a little bit recessed. It's got little indentations in it. And the space between boards is going to be a lot lighter, or sorry, a lot darker. I'm going to switch over and throw another adjustment layer on there called levels. Now, levels gives me what's called a histogram. This tells me where's my information. When you look at an image, most of the time people are unaware, but most images contain a lot of what are called midtones. Think of midtones as 50% gray. All right, 50% gray, all of that gray information, all those subtle layers of gray make up most of our image. The trouble is that's contained in a real small area, similar to this. So this on the right, these are my brights. This is the whitest part of the image as possible. Notice there is no information over here because there's basically no pure white. Notice over here on the left where the darks are, there are no pure blacks. Here's 50% gray. It's a little bit lighter than 50% gray, most of this image. But there's a lot of stuff that's still like 50% gray. So this is why this image works pretty good as a bump map, because the boards themselves, that base color of the wood is roughly about 50% gray. So that lays flat. The space between the boards is darker, so that will go down. And the very subtle changes in gray for the grain of the wood go down, but not as much as the boards. And that's why this image would work. Not all images have that kind of information, and that's why you can't always use them as a bump map. Now, honestly, if I'm going to use this as a bump map, I'm going to change, and this is another reason why I like levels, is I basically want to compress it so that I get more contrast between the dark gray and the light gray. And to do that, I'm going to take my white slider here, and I'm going to drop it down to where it starts to raise up. And look what it's doing to my image. It's making it a little lighter. I'm going to take my darks and slide that over until it starts to raise up. Now, my darks, those little areas between the boards, are a lot darker. Not quite as flat. Now, as far as my gray, if I want it to be a little lighter, I can drag it to the left. If I want to make it a little darker, I can drag it to the right. I'm increasing that area of dark, or I'm increasing the area of white. In this case, I pretty much want to keep it like right in the middle. I'd really like to make that a little bit lighter. So now with just a little bit of tweaking, I can actually make this from being kind of a mushy, like flat gray, to being something that's got a little more pop to it that'll stand out a little better as a bump map. Does that make sense? Questions? Yeah. The brick? Yeah, we're actually going to get to that when we make it. And we're going to use a couple other things. Like for one thing, grout is lighter, but when we make it black and white, obviously it's going to be too light. So we have to invert it. And then we have to play around with the contrast of it. Now, if you forget to do that here, don't forget, you can always invert it when you bring it into Maya. But a lot of times it's better to do it in Photoshop, because if you give this file to somebody, they may wig out and go, wait a minute, they're giving me a height map with everything reversed. That doesn't make sense. So if it's you and you know what you're doing, you know what you've done, you can just reverse it in Maya. But honestly, good workflow, good work practice dictates change it in the original. And you'll see that when we start working with this stuff, we're going to save these files out as PSD, so we keep all these layers in case we have to go back in and tweak it. Does that make sense? Questions? Good questions. Really good. Jonathan, any questions? Amber, questions? Jonathan's good. All right, so one of the things that I always preach about too is whenever you open any image off the internet, it's probably going to be a JPEG, it might be a TIFF, it might be a PNG. When you take it off the internet and you need to work on it, go into Photoshop, save it as a PSD. Why save it as a PSD? It doesn't compress it, and if you make any changes like layering, it will keep layers also. Remember, every time you open a JPEG, you are basically rebuilding all the information that was lost when it compressed it. Now, compression works by going in and taking a look at the image and going, all right, you told me you want me to make this a medium size image. So that means I'm going to try and keep most of the information. I'm going to get rid of as much as I can. So what it's going to do, it's going to look at all the light areas, all the areas that are equally toned, like gray here, the white here, the black here. It's going to look at all those areas and go, you know what? I can reconstruct all that based on about 20 or 30 pixels, just in random spots. And what it'll do is when you go to close it, it'll keep those pixels, trash the rest. When it opens again, it's going to go, okay, we got to rebuild all these pixels, and it's got a list of the pixels it's got to rebuild. And we're going to use these pixels to rebuild those. So it rebuilds them all by filling them in with the same pixel. Once you open and close a JPEG 10 times, you've degraded the quality 50%. So when you open it, work on it, save it, you compress it again. So it's open, expand, work on, compress, throw information away. And it's a vicious cycle. Do it in Photoshop until you need a version to work with. And then in Maya or most other programs, save it as either an EXR. In Maya, we're going to save them as targas. you can save them as PNGs or as JPEGs, but remember, they're going to be compressed again. Depends on what your needs are. All right. So let's take a look at some of the tools we're going to use when we work with Photoshop. All right, so most of you know this already, but I'm going to go over it anyway. In Photoshop, all the tools are usually lined up on the left side. Any tools that have similar tool sets are together, and they've got a little triangle in the corner. Lower right corner gives you tools that are very similar. So for instance, there's my brush. Underneath my brush, there's this rubber stamper. If I click on that, there, come on, give me. Come on, where are you? All right, Photoshop stopped working. Come on. All right. Well, wake up. No, I don't want your Cupid, your stupid movie. All right, well, you saw it work once. There's a sub menu that comes up, and it will give you the option of choosing similar tools. So for the clone stamp, which is here, you have a choice of clone stamp or you have a choice of pattern stamp. We don't want pattern, we want clone. All right, there we go. So clone stamp, pattern stamp, clone stamp's the one we want. For me, right above the brush is something called the healing brush tool. You've got a choice of similar tools: spot healing, healing brush, patch tool, content aware, red eye. We like the healing brush because the healing brush works a little bit like the clone stamp, but it allows you to average colors together. And that's really the beauty of it. All right, in Photoshop, we're going to be using the crop tool, which is this tool right here. In the crop tool, you've got a couple of ways to crop it. You can keep it square. You can go up and choose just resolution, and it doesn't matter. Oh, if you have numbers in resolution, no, you don't understand. I want that. There we go. All right, so resolution will let you resize it any size you want. If you set it to square, it will always conform no matter how big you do or how small you make that crop. It's always going to be conformed to that square aspect ratio. Now, anytime you're in a tool, if you want to cancel an operation, right up top here in the tool options bar, you're going to see you've got a check mark, which will activate and complete the tool operation. You can cancel it or you can undo. I'm just going to cancel it and just go grab another tool. All right, so when you select a tool, Photoshop gives you tool attributes across the top called options. They are specific to the tool you've selected. For example, the clone stamp utilizes brush sizes just like a traditional brush does. You can also change the hardness of the brush. All right, so what I'm going to do is let's open up the clone stamp practice that we give you guys. This is a JPEG. All right, so if you're not familiar with navigation in Photoshop, it's really simple. If you're on a Mac, Command plus and minus, you can zoom in and out just by using keyboard. If you're on a PC, obviously it's Control plus and minus. If you're zoomed in Photoshop and you want to pan around, it's a lot easier to use the hand tool, which you can activate by holding the space bar down. And that will let you move it around inside in Photoshop. A little bit like Maya's pan tool. All right, change brush sizes in Photoshop. What's the shortcut key? Anybody? Yep, use left and right brackets. That will resize it for you. To fix parameters, once you get below a certain size, it'll start doing it 1 pixel at a time. So for example, the clone stamp tool here has basically a little circle just like the brush. So I can scale that up. I can scale it down. All right. Now, the whole idea behind clone stamping is we're going to use a non-destructive workflow, which means we are not going to stamp on top of the original pixels. The beauty of this tool is the ability for it to sample on a different layer and clone to the layer it's on. So in Photoshop, when we go to start working on getting rid of seams or removing blemishes on an image, we always start with a new blank layer. And in Photoshop, you'll know it's blank because it's got that little gray white checker. So I'm just going to rename this clone layer. Photoshop, you can give it spaces, you can give it special characters in the name, it doesn't care. Now, since I've opened this image, it's a JPEG, I'm going to save it as a PSD. That way it will stop compression and I can keep all my layers. So let's go File, Save As. I'm going to keep it as a PSD. All right, so now we're all saved. Got a blank clone layer. I'm actually on that layer because that's what I have selected. So in the clone stamp options across the top, you want to make sure that your brush size is 100%. We do not want soft edge blurry pixels when we start clone stamping. Nothing says, hey, this image has been altered, then fuzzy pixels. All right, so hardness, 100%. Make sure the mode is set to normal. We don't want any special effects like multiply or add or any of the other things. Make sure your opacity and flow are at 100%. We're not trying to build up line weight like you are when you sketch. The angle, 0, make it aligned. This is probably one of the biggest options. This is what really makes the clone stamp tool awesome. Sample. Next to sample, the default is usually current layer. What that means is it will only sample and stamp on the current layer you're on. You want to switch it to current and below, which means it will sample on the layer below my current layer, which is my background layer. So I can copy pixels there, but it will let me stamp them onto this blank clone stamp layer. So I can basically cover up the pixels I don't want without ruining the original image or the original layer. So current and below, to activate the clone tool, or I should say the clone portion, you hold the Option key down and it turns into a little bullseye. When you're in that mode, what you want to do is, well, for example, let's go up here. And I want to clone out that little piece of white dirt on the carpet. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to make my brush just big enough to cover it up with a few extra pixels on either side. What I want to look for is similar pixels around that area to cover it up. So if I come all the way over here and clone stamp, well, you can clearly see that doesn't work. So what I want to do is try to find pixels that are very similar to what I have and stamp there. So now that I've stamped, and by the way, when you sample, hold Option down. When you click Release Option, now you're in stamp mode. So let me do that again. So to sample or clone, hold Option down, find the area you want to sample, click once, Release Option. Now you're back in stamp mode and stamp. Now, if I turn off my clone layer, you'll see that I haven't altered the original pixels at all. So I can do the same thing with pixels over here, or, the same area over here. Again, I'm just trying to look for pixels that have the same color value, the same color. When I do a bigger area, I personally like to do it in several chunks because I don't like to use the same pixels all the time. The thing about the clone stamp tool is wherever you sample from and stamp, it maintains the distance of your original sample point. So it's sampling right now, right around that area, but it's all just the same pixel. So what I like to do is just pick a couple of pixels here, maybe some over here. Again, just trying to break it up a little. If I don't like it, I can always Z back, but the beauty is I can erase just that little section in my layer and fix it. Come up here, do that. Come up to the top up here, do the same thing, hold down Option, sample, come down here, and then stamp. You can even come in and fix these little pulls on the carpet. So a little small, let's make it a little bigger. Let's just take this area and kind of stamp that in there. So this is also a really good technique for restoring old photos. Anything that's got creases in it or cracks, blemishes, can always restore some family photos or images that are interesting that you really want to try and, get some life out of. All right, does that make sense? Clone stamp. Now, the healing brush. The healing brush is really good for taking two different colors and trying to average them together. It's sort of like the clone stamp tool meets, meets a blend and somehow where it takes one color, the other color, and kind of mix them together until they get something in the middle. All right, so the clone stamp is basically, the healing brush is basically like a Band-Aid. It has the same parameters as the clone stamp, which means you want to make sure your hardness is at 100%. Make sure the mode is normal. Make sure that your source is stamped or sampled. That's what we're doing. Turn off align, turn off use legacy, sample. This also requires you to turn on current and below. Without that, it will only work on one layer. So current and below. Now, what this will do, first off, let me do a clone stamp of this. Make that a little bigger. So I cover up that brass electrical access cover, and I'm basically just putting carpet right on top of it. But with the healing brush, let's come down here, sample this area. Now with the healing brush, what it'll do is it will remove it, but take the color of the brass, the color of the carpet, and kind of average it together. So it looks like it's been there, but it's pulled up and it's kind of bled onto the carpet. You know something was there, but it's been taken up or fixed or just altered a little. This is really good when you've got two parts. For example, we're going to hit this in the brick wall, top and bottom. You got two slightly different colors of brick. You want to average the seam together so it becomes less noticeable. So these two tools are pretty much most of the arsenal for getting rid of seams. All right, does that make sense? Questions? Anybody? Amber's good. Thank you. Jonathan, questions in Zoom? Jonathan's good. All right. Let me save this PSD file here. And no, don't. Well, wait a minute. Do I want to save this? No, don't save. All right. So real quick, things to avoid when you're looking at images to work on, or textures even. You want to avoid anything with lighting or shadows baked in. Baked in means they've been photographed with a definite light source at a specific time or a specific position. This, you would have to spend time getting rid of all those highlights on this bread in order to make it work, because your lighting is not necessarily going to work and give you highlights where they are on the bread. You're going to come up with like double highlights. It's going to look really weird. But in all honesty, in your career, you will probably be given this and be expected to take out all the highlights, because it happens. I mean, I started out life as a graphic designer, and people used to give me like stuff that they drew on napkins at lunch and ketchup and mustard. I'm not kidding. So then I would have to scan them in and then, take them into Illustrator and trace them and try and, oh yeah, here you go. Here's your lunchtime logo. Or I would get pizza menus, and pizza places would always take their own pictures because, if you're running a pizza shop, you're running on a shoestring budget anyway. You're not making a ton of money, and they try and save cost, and everything would have a flash on it. So then you got to go into Photoshop and you got to clone out the flash or move it out. So I learned a lot about Photoshop and how to tweak images and how to actually bring out, kind of correct the midtones when you get a really crappy camera that's got too much midtones and you can't see any detail. Everything's too dark. So Photoshop is a really good tool for doing all that. In fact, a lot of times I would suggest take your stuff into Photoshop and look at it before you bring it into Substance if you're going to do textures, because you can do a lot of correction in Photoshop before Substance. Photoshop is, on above all else, an image editing program. That's really where its strength is. Yeah, it does a whole bunch of other stuff, but image editing is where Photoshop is at. Now, you want to avoid all this stuff. Also, avoid any images that have reflections in them, because that implies an environment that may not work with your environment. Also, when somebody tells you to make something tileable, get it in writing what they mean by that. Do you mean in U and in V, or do you just mean in one direction? If they are unsure, assume it's got to be in both directions. In fact, I always assume it unless somebody specifically says, oh, no, we just wanted one. Like, are you sure? Because you're not going to be able to repeat it this direction, only this one. Yeah. Get it in writing. Honest. All right. So here's our brick wall. Our mandate is to make it repeatable. Whenever you want to make something repeatable, best thing you can do is make it a square aspect ratio. Why? Because computers work best with squares. Everything is built on, well, the whole architecture of a computer is built on the power of 2. 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, 2048. Go on and on and on. Memory architecture is built that way. Computers think in chunks like that. And if you have an image that's square, it's very easy for the computer to take that information and just position it around rather than give it like weird angles, weird dimensions. So we're going to keep it square. We're going to remove the parts of the image we don't want. The watermark, the incomplete course of bricks at the top and the bottom. And what we're going to do is we're going to crop it so it's right in the middle of the grout. So the top of the grout lines up with the bottom of the grout. And then Photoshop has a tool very similar to Maya's repeat U and V. It's called the offset, which will allow us to take our seam, take it from the outer edges and shift it into the center of the image resolution. And this is where we paint the seams out, in the middle. Once we're done that, we're going to wind up with seams like this. Make a new layer, clone stamp it out. We are basically going to be able to, once we're done with all these layers, we still want to keep everything in separate layers, but Photoshop will only allow you to apply a filter to a single layer at a time. So we're basically going to be doing a little Photoshop voodoo, selecting layers, duplicating them, flattening them, and applying a filter there. We're basically going to apply a very simple sharpen, which is called high pass filter, just to get a little more contrast between the pixels. Now, Photoshop has tons of sharpen tools. There's sharpen, sharpen more, sharpen edges, unsharp mask, smart sharpen, sharpen, motion blur. There's just everything. But this is a very simple tool that will sharpen the darks and the lights, but let the midtones go through. And basically, it kind of looks flat like that until you're done. And we'll compare the results of the two. Once we're done with that, that's going to be our color map. That will be repeatable. Then we're going to make it grayscale. And as we discussed, if we try to use that as a bump map, the grout's going to come out. It's going to look like an ice cream sandwich. It's melting and you bite into it and all the ice cream oozes out. We don't want that. We want to invert it. Like I said, my favorite tool is levels. I can see where everything is, get a little more contrast so I can really get the bricks to be a little bit lighter than 50% gray so they pop out a little, the grout to go in, and that's basically going to be our bump map. All right, so the workflow is all here. We're going to start by opening up that image. So let's open up the brick wall. I'm going to do a save as immediately. Why? Because it's Photoshop. I don't trust it any more than I do Maya. So Photoshop. All right, we want to crop it. Right now, our resolution is 1361 by 904. You can see that in the bottom left corner of your Photoshop interface. In fact, if you click on that, you'll be able to see the pixels, the channels, and the actual resolution. Most screen resolution is 72 dots per inch. If anybody ever does print, you want at least 300, if not 600, or depending on what you want, maybe even 1200 dots. So the resolution is going to be a lot higher. All right, so got this, it's saved. First thing we want to do is crop it. So I'm going to activate the crop tool, and I want to make it square aspect ratio 1:1. Now, the first thing I want to do, let me zoom in a little. First thing I want to do is I want to bring the top down, and notice it's going to bring the sides in also because it's square. I want to get it so it's about halfway in the grout. Why? Because that top is going to line up with the bottom, and I want to do the same thing to the bottom. Now, this is not completely level. Some of the bricks are not level, which is okay. Let's go down and take a look at the bottom. So I want to do the same thing at the bottom. Bring it up, bring it about halfway here. Now, part of the problem is that works good. Now I've got a complete set of bricks at the top and the bottom with grout. But I've still got part of my watermark in there. Now, if I take this and move it on the side, it's going to resize my bottom and top, which I don't want to do. However, what you can do in Photoshop, let me zoom out a little. Now, forget it, I'll just do this. There we go. All right, so if you're very careful in Photoshop, you can actually slide the image underneath the crop, and Photoshop will maintain, it knows you're trying to slide it on an axis, and it will try to maintain and give you a little bit of snap. Like it's got a little bit of edge there, but it kind of snaps in. What I want to do is slide it over so I basically get at least one, if not two, kind of these smaller partial bricks. I want at least to have one edge where I get half the grout on a couple of them. Now, what's going to happen is this left side is going to line up with the right, and you can see this little bit of brick image here is going to complete this. This is going to complete that. This little bit here will kind of snap in there. This little bit will come over here. So that's kind of what I want to see. Now, honestly, when you're trying to make a repeatable texture, if you do most of your work being careful with the crop, you'll save yourself a ton of cleanup time. And if your crop doesn't work the first time, undo it, go back and do it again. It's totally worth the extra time. So what I'm going to do is, now that I've done this, I want to see what it looks like. So I'm going to click the check button. And now I want to see my new image. What's it going to look like when I offset it? And basically, offsetting is going to take the seam, the left side, shift it into the middle, the top, slide it down to the middle. So I'll be able to see what it looks like when these two parts meet. Now, how much do you offset it? My new cropped image is 787 by 786. And you say, what? I thought you cropped it in Photoshop, keeping it square. If you're off a pixel, that's okay. Because the crop may have been halfway between pixels somewhere, and Photoshop will just go to the next either upper or lower part of the pixel. So when I figure out how much I want to offset it, I want to offset it half. And I'm not going to choose an odd number. I'm going to choose an even number. So I want to figure out, well, what is half of 786? Now, your numbers could be different. Your numbers could be 788, 786, 787, 789. All right, so I'm going to take my, first let's go to non-scary mode. There we go. And let's do 786 divided by 2. That's going to be my offset. I'm going to offset my pixels vertically and horizontally 393 pixels. That is half of 786. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Photoshop will not allow you to apply a filter to more than one layer. I don't care if you've got the layer in a group or you've selected both layers, it's not going to do it. Fortunately, single layer, go to filter, we go to other, and we go to offset down at the bottom. Now in Photoshop, if you've got a menu item that has 3 dots or an ellipse, that will give you user input. It's basically going to bring up a dialog box. If you do not see any 3 dots, that means it will activate the command, whatever it is, no input from you, you're done. So the default of this is going to be 0, which means it's going to look exactly like it did when we cropped it. So what I want to do horizontal is plug in my 393. You can see it shifts over the horizontal part. And I want to offset it vertically 393. Why? Because I want to take all the seams and stick them right down the middle. Because this is where I want to clone it out. If I clone this out, there is no need to offset it again. It is already seamless. So if you're not happy with this, cancel, undo your crop, go back, recrop it again, because you want to have just a little bit of work. So I click OK. Let me zoom in here. And you can see, it's not bad. I got a little bit of a partial brick to fill in at the top and the bottom. I got a few seams going up the middle, some color variation. My horizontal seam right here is not really that bad. It's not too noticeable. So all in all, I'm going to keep this and this will work. Now, the next step is create a blank layer and we're going to start cloning stuff out. Zoom in just a little bit more. There we go. All right, so brand new layer. Let's call that clone layer. I'm going to activate the clone stamp tool. Check your settings. Yep, flow's good. Sample current and below. Make sure you're on the new layer. What I'm going to do is resize my brush. And I need to continue this bottom edge over to here. All right, so let's see what we can do with this. Let's try and sample this area right here. So I might take a little smaller area and just kind of just try and fill that in a little. Now, whatever you do at the top, make sure you do at the bottom because top and bottom are going to line up. So this one, let's go here. And let's see if we can do that. Don't like it. Z back. And let's just fill in some areas here. All right, so I got the two areas at the top and the bottom. They're sort of fixed okay. Let's take a look at this block right here. This one's got some color variation. So for this one, I think I'm going to use the healing brush because I want to average those colors together. So let's grab the healing brush, current and below, resize it just like you would with the clone. Hold Option down to sample. Let's go here. And let's stamp. Don't like that. Stamp, current and below, normal. Yes. Spot healing brush is supposed to be for smaller areas. I don't think it's got the same broad usage that the clone stamp does, or the healing brush. Healing brush is meant for slightly bigger areas. I've seen people use spot healing for removing, there's a red eye tool in here, but I've seen people use it to remove red eye also. Or just a really small minor blemish. All right, so that helps. Got a little area here. Maybe I'll use some healing brush here also, just to kind of get rid of some of those seams. And again, I'm really just trying to come in and minimize these seams. Oop, don't like that. All right, so then I'll come in and fix some of these areas that have actual little sections taken out of them like this. For that, I'm going to use the healing brush or the clone stamp. All right, any areas that you have grout, you probably want to get your clone stamp tool to be pretty small and make sure you sample a good area. Healing brush. This one, hard to tell, probably easier to use the clone stamp. Again, you don't want to use too long of a stroke. If you're taking the clone stamp, you want to make it short and sweet, resample pixels so it looks more random. All right, questions? Make sense? All right, now, I've kind of cloned out everything, mostly. I want to keep this kind of going forward so I don't run out of time. So let's go take a look at the doc and see where we're at. So we did the crop, we did the offset, we've cloned out some stuff. Now what we want to do is take all the layers that we've got, which is basically the background layer and the clone stamp layer. And what I want to do is combine them and make them a workable layer to apply a filter to. I don't want to combine these permanently because I want them still to be separate in case I have to go back and do more clone stamp work. But I'm going to select the background layer, shift select the clone layer, right click and duplicate layers. When you duplicate layers in Photoshop, you'll get this dialog box. Just click OK. It will automatically put the word copy at the end of your duplicated layers and highlight them, which is exactly what you want. Because now these two layers that are my duplicates, I want to right click and I want to merge those layers. So now I've got my merged layer. This is going to be my high pass filter layer to apply a little bit of sharpness to the image. So I'm going to rename this, call this high pass filter. Don't forget to save in Photoshop once in a while. All right, so the high pass filter is basically just a combination of background and clone layer. But if I select these two layers, Photoshop says, no way, you're not applying a filter to it. And that's why we do this. Now, high pass happens to be in the same place that offset was. It's under filter, other, high pass. Again, 3 dots, an ellipse. That means it will give us a dialog box. Now, high pass filter works on pixels. So you can set the radius of the filter. That means how big the filter will be. You can set it up to 1,000, which is actually bigger than the image. You can set it as low as 0.1 of a pixel, which is kind of ridiculous because Photoshop doesn't really understand a partial pixel. So we usually keep our clone stamp somewhere between 1 and 2. I keep it at 0.1 or 1.5, which is kind of halfway. You can try other numbers, but this works pretty good as far as applying a little bit of a contrast between the other two. So I click OK. Now I'm left with this, and you say, great, all that work that I did is just ruined. Thank you. No. What we need to do is we need to use what is called a blend mode. Now, by default in Photoshop, unless layers have areas that are invisible or transparent, you can't see lower layers. Layers cover up other layers. That's the stacking order. Anything on the bottom gets covered by a layer above it. But we have what are called blend modes, which allow us to have layers interact with each other. So we select the high pass filter layer, and right above that section, right above the top layer, I should say, is an area called normal, and that is your blend mode. Normal is simply an overlay, which means top layer covers bottom layer. But Photoshop has a ton of blend modes, which allows layers to interact. The great thing about the newer versions of Photoshop is, as I go through all these different options, they give me a preview in my image, and I can see exactly what I want. Like, none of these do what I want it to do. Lighten, screen. Nope, too much, until I get to overlay. So overlay will allow the midtones to go through, but keep the highs and the lows of the top layer. So the midtones pass through that and basically allow the highs and the lows that have a little more contrast. So I realize this is blown up and enlarged, but take a look at the difference between no high pass and high pass. So this is without the high pass filter. We didn't sharpen the highs and the lows. And this is, you get, it's very subtle, but it's enough to make the image feel a little crisper. And honestly, my advice is, anything you get off the internet, go into Photoshop and see, use one of Photoshop's sharpening tools, see if it looks better, giving it a little more contrast, because the compression process softens pixels terribly. Now, the nice thing about having this as a layer is that I can adjust the opacity, which acts kind of like an intensity slider. So if I want to lower the effect of the sharpen, I can basically just lower this. So really just a very subtle bit of sharpening. So these three layers now are going to become my base color. These are now, they should be, which they are. I have confidence in Photoshop. These are seamless now, as seamless as we can make it. So what I'm going to do is, first off, save my PSD, then do a save as. The format we want to bring it back into Maya in is going to be a Targa. Now, just like with all the other templates that you've worked with, Photoshop says, wait a minute, it's a PSD. You can't directly save it as a Targa. You have to go over here and make a copy. So don't have the option, but hit save a copy. Come down here. Now we can choose Targa. I'm going to remove the word copy. I always like to put an underscore and put base color. If I could spell, that would just be awesome. So now if I hand this off to somebody, technically they should know where it goes. It goes into base color. What part of the material is that? Well, it's your base, it's your diffuse. Target options. We're still 24-bit. On Monday, we're going to get into making alpha channels. We'll jump to 32 because we're going to have basically an opacity channel, which is our alpha channel, and a color channel all in one file. All right, so 24-bit, done, save. Now we're going to take this, make it a bump map. So first process, or first step, ask yourself, do I need color information for the map I'm making? For a bump, what do we need? Black and white. So we don't need color. So let's go down and apply an adjustment layer. Again, that half dark, half light circle. About halfway down the list is black and white. Now, Photoshop will automatically convert the reds to the proper shaded gray, the greens to a proper shaded gray, and the blues to a proper shaded gray. In fact, Photoshop built the table that the industry uses for accurate conversion of color to black and white, getting the proper shades of gray. So you don't have to adjust any of the properties. They're automatic. So part one done. Then you look at this and go, will this give me the results that I want? We're going to use it as a bump map. Are my lights going to go up in the right place? Or the dark's going to go down? So for this, is it going to work as is? Nope. We need to invert it. So one more adjustment layer. Go down, and invert is about 3/4 of the way down. All that's going to do is flip black and white. So now our grout's going in the right direction. Our bricks, they're right in that 50% gray area. They're going to be flat. And we've got some areas that are light, some areas that are dark. Some people for a bump map don't like those imperfections, but I do. Because if you go out and look on any brick wall, any brick, even outside here on our pillars, they are not all perfectly flat and uniform. There are areas that go in, there are little bubbles that come out. That's what makes brick actually kind of cool. Kind of a cross, it's kind of like domesticated stone, or, you know, it's something that we've made that's very stone-like, but we can make into a shape easily because we mold it. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to add another adjustment layer to get a little more contrast out of it. And honestly, any one of these contrast and brightness levels, curves, exposure, you tweaking them enough, you can sort of get the results. But like I said, I prefer levels because I like the picture. I like that histogram, so I know exactly where my information is. And look at the bricks. Look how much information is in 50% gray. That's good. Now I know where everything is. And you can see I hardly have, well, there's virtually no whites and no blacks. I'm going to take my white slider, which is the slider all the way on the right, and I'm going to drag it up till it starts to slope upward. Right about there. I'm also going to take the darks, drag them so they start to slope upwards also. I mean, you could even take them like right around in the middle here. Call that, because basically what you're saying is this is now my darkest part and this is now the lightest part of my image. If I want to get more contrast in the middle, I can drag my mid-tone slider, which is the gray one in the middle. I can drag it to the left, that'll lighten up the bricks. Drag it to the right, that'll darken them. What I want to try and do is lighten the bricks up a little bit so they come out more. I don't want them to be level. Yes. Yes. Now they're going to be coming out. Depends on where the bricks you get are from. If you take a look at the bricks outside there on the pillar, I believe there are some areas that actually do come out. Now, unless they're polished bricks. In that case, yeah, you'd have to go back and flatten all that out. Honestly, I don't mind that because in my opinion, let me turn off the levels. Let's turn off the invert. The areas of black and white are going to be reversed. It's almost going to be an even split. Like those dark areas are not going to be light. There are some little light areas that are going to now become dark. So you're right in that it might look unnatural, but depends on how close you are to the camera. I actually don't mind it because, I mean, if you take a look at our backlot also right around, was it Bourbon Street, you know, where that whole Louisiana area, there's a lot of, there's even grout there that comes out of the bricks. So they have a couple of buildings with the grout going in, a couple of buildings with the grout going out. There are some areas where the bricks are really rough like this. They'll come out, they'll go in. Depends on the location, depends on what style you're in. For us, we're doing an accent brick wall. I'm kind of thinking this might go in the interior on that window wall because that's a separate piece of geometry from the rest of the house. And a lot of times those accent walls in homes are a result of either renovations for factories or urban areas. And they're usually what they call used brick, which means even if they are put into the building new, they are taken from another wall. And the whole idea with them is they have different color variations. They're all rough, part of the charm. So yeah, I see what you're saying. You're absolutely right. It depends on the circumstances. Like I said, there are people that hate this. They will come in and they will fill in all the imperfections. Yes and no, but the problem is you really need to do it we're working on layers. We really need to do it way down here. So what you might want to do is, if you have that circumstance, make another layer, a clone layer, or not a clone layer, but just another layer in general, and do that to kind of, well, the easiest way to do it would be use like the healing brush to average the colors together. Just go into all the bricks and give it a good average, and then turn that layer on when you're making the bump map. Now, another part that you could try is, there's another way to do it, which is more complicated, but you could take a base color. I could take, for example, we made it black and white. I could take this and just basically wash out I could try to wash that out altogether. Take this, lay it on top, use a blend mode of multiply. That would allow the gray underneath to show through, and then I'd have flat. That would be an easy way to do it. Like I said, I'm not partial to that just because I like imperfection. Yeah, no problem. I can always Z back. Yeah, I guess that's where I was. Yeah, that's where I was. Okay. So for this is basically going to be our bump map. We can go File, Save As. Don't forget, we're saving it as a Targa file, so we got to save a copy. Let's go down, save it as a Targa, get rid of the word copy, and let's put bump. 24-bit. Save your PSD. Let's go check and see what we got. So there's our base color, and there's our bump, all made from the same file. Now, for these to work, we need to put them into the source images folder of our project. So I'm actually going to copy all three of these. I like the PSD in case I want to go back in and adjust my, my color map, or I need to redo my bump. So I'm going to copy them. And let's put them into the Zen Garden source images. This is where I have my project set, right here, inside here, and let's paste. So now I got my base color, my bump, we're all set to go. Goodbye, Photoshop. I'm going to quit out of PowerPoint because the fewer programs I have running, the better it is for everybody. All right, what I'm going to do, make sure my project is set, going to open the scene up. We're going to take a look at the area that we placed the brick in, that asphalt parking lot area. Set project, Zen Garden. Let's open up Lecture 8. All right, so that's roughly the scale that I want to have. Could be a little on the big side, but that's okay. So let's start off. I'm going to do a quick render. And let's take that base color down a little, or the base weight. All right, I'm going to assign a new AI standard surface to it so I can have a brand new comparison. Now, a lot of times, if I've got a bump map and a diffuse map or a color map, I like to apply the bump first so I can see what it's doing, where it is, get the scale, get the amount of bump correct before I add in the color. So I'm not distracted by color. So basically what I'm going to do is go down in the material that I've just assigned. Let's go to geometry, bump mapping, 2D texture, file. Under value, you'll see that something's plugged in already, which is file 5. I'm going to load in my bump map that I just made. Now, you can sort of get a preview in Arnold. It shows you a very, very rough version of what this will look like. So right now, if I render this, it's gigantic. Let's also drop our weight down. So it's gigantic. Let's set the scale. Now, one thing you may notice is we've made this square, but look at our shape. Our shape is not square, so we're getting bricks that are stretched. So what I need to do is figure out, all right, I can't scale this uniformly because of the weird size of the geometry. So let's see. Looks like I need to have more repeats in U, which I think is this. Yeah, that looks a little better. Still looks a little stretched. And that looks a little better. All right, now, it's kind of giving me a preview of it. Like I said, anytime you're using a bump map, the amount of bump is way too much. So let's graph the brick. Let's get the bump utility. Let's knock that down to 0.1. Looks a little better. It should render a little better too. And I can probably go a little bit lower. Let's try 0.5. All right, so I figured out how much bump I want. I figured out the scale. Let's drape the color in with it also. So color gets plugged into where? Where does the color map get plugged into? Base color, thank you. So base color. Let's bring up a place 2D file. Let's plug our color map into the file node. There's our base color. And now you can see that my color map does not drape the same way that my bump map does. And here's the reason. So here's our bump map network here. And here's our file node up here. Notice we have two place 2D textures. This one's driving the brick bump. We've got that repeating 12 and 6. This one is driving the color. That's 1 and 1. Wouldn't it make sense to be able to drive all your maps with the same place 2D? That way, if you change scale, you change it on all of them. The answer is yes, you absolutely want that. You don't want to have to go in multiple locations. But like anything with Maya, there's a price to pay. You have to do it with the middle mouse key or the middle mouse button, either on your pen tablet or your mouse, and you need a modifier key. All right, so the way it works is I want this place 2D to also drive my color. What I want to do is I want to hold down the command key. I'm going to middle mouse on top of this level of detail icon in my place 2D. Middle mouse click, drag, and I'm going to drop it on top of the little icon of my brick in file 6. And when I let go of my mouse button, Oops, you don't have to worry about that. Let go of your mouse button. It will automatically make the connections. Except that my mouse wigs out. Stop doing it. It's not a mouse. My tablet just goes crazy. All right, stop doing it. Let's do this again. There we go. All right. Well, let me see if I can redo this. Let's Z back. Can I Z back? No. I hate you, Maya. Okay. So let's go in and do it again. So I want to put the color on. Color map. What I want to do is have my place 2D that we set up for the bump. This one right here, I want it to drive my color. So one more time, what I'm going to do is I want to hold down middle mouse. Well, actually, I want to hold down Command. Middle mouse click this level of detail icon. This is on the place 2D that has my proper repeats. Hold Command, middle mouse click, drag it, drop it on top of no, stop doing stuff. All right. Come on. Now it's stuck. Stop. All right, there we go. All right, now this is disconnected. And you'll see that now my color and my bump all line up. This can be discarded. We can throw that out. So now I have one place 2D driving the bump and also driving the color. Go to one location to change how it repeats and how it looks. Makes it so much easier. And I can change the amount of bump. I can change the repeat all in one shot. So now if I zoom out, you'll see we got a little bit of a noticeable repeat, but not nearly as bad as it was before. Got a little color variation here, but you really don't notice it till you zoom out a lot. If I come in and do a close-up, most of the time you're not even going to see that. All right, does that make sense? Questions? The amount of bump? Yeah. That would be, so easiest way to get to it is in Hypershade. If you graph your network. So here's my brick. Let me just graph it. It's called the bump utility. And in there, it's your bump depth. The amount of bump by default at 1 is way too high. Just knock it down. Start at 0.1, go up or down based on what your reference is. Like I said, the funny thing about a bump map is less is always more. It looks much better with the least amount of bump you need because you're just trying to get some surface detail. Good question. Any others? All right. Anybody have any questions in Zoom? So Jonathan's good. Amber, any questions? AJ, any questions? All right, let's see. So if you want to try your hand at a couple of things, like I said, in that PowerPoint, you can try doing the wood. If you want, you can definitely use that wood if you're doing the interior, if you want to try it on the floor. Alligator skin, you could always add that to a pillow, maybe fabric on one of the chairs if you want to. If not, find your own textures. Don't forget, when you are looking for textures, you want to go large, you want to try and find at least a 2K texture. Better if you find 4, 2K will work for the size of the images that we're rendering. All right, so if there are no questions, this is a good time to break for dinner. So let's see, dinner break, come back to lab at, come back at 5:55. All right, if I don't see you, have a good dinner. Have a good weekend. I will see you guys on Monday. Remember, Tony Bagsby will be here on Friday to do Substance Painter. So you're going to be doing stuff in Substance, bringing it back into Maya and applying them into the Arnold materials.